So today what I want to look at is actually answer the question of who I think biblically the sheep actually are. And when we see that mentioned, that when we're defined or compared to being God's sheep in the Gospel of John, what is he getting at? Who are these people and how do they become sheep? So I'm going to read this passage again and then we'll get into answering that question. John 10:25 through 30. Jesus is talking to the Jews, and he says, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. There are those who are presently at that moment in time. They were Jesus' sheep. They did in some way. They did belong to him. And these guys, these Jews who he's talking to, they do not believe his words. They're not receiving him. And Jesus says that is an indication, that is a clear indication that you are, in fact, not my sheep. If we look back at John 8, I think it brings a lot of clarity to answering this question of who the sheep are. So it's Jesus again talking to the Jews, and they answered him. This is John 8:39. They answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. So this is another way of saying what we saw a minute ago, that if Jesus said, if you were my sheep, you would be believing me. The fact that you're not believing me is a fact that you are not my sheep. And so that's what he's saying here. He's saying that you're not doing the works of Abraham. If you were truly Abraham's children, aka if you were truly my sheep, you would be doing the same works that Abraham did. Or, what works did Abraham do? He believed, right? So if we see that this is a clear parallel. If you were my sheep, if you were Abraham's children, you would be believing me like Abraham did. You would have faith. If you're children of Abraham, then you will do the works of Abraham, which is to walk in the footsteps of the faith of Abraham. And so immediately, I think this is starting to bring a little bit of clarity as to who the sheep are that Jesus is talking about in John 10. Let me finish out John 8, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more. So in verse 40, he says, you would be doing the works of Abraham if you were his children, but now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. So Abraham did not try to kill. He didn't lash back in rebellion against God, but rather he believed God. You are doing the works your father did. They said to him, we were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me. And so again, this is the same thing. You would love me here. Love is equal to belief. And again, here being a child of God is equivalent to being a child of Abraham. And so I think we could also parallel that to John 10, where being a child of Abraham, being a child of God equals being a sheep of God. And we know that being in any one of these categories will result in love for God and will result in faith in God. It will result in believing God, as Jesus says in John 10. It will result in doing the works that Abraham did. If you're really God's sheep, you will believe. And so these guys are claiming that God is their father. They're claiming that they belong to him, that they know him, they're obedient, and they're walking with him. And Jesus is saying, well, your response to me shows that you don't love God. And in essence, what he's saying is, I am God. You're claiming that you love God and you believe in God and you know him and he's your father. And now I'm here. I've shown up and you don't believe me. You're not accepting me. This shows that you're lying. You don't really know God. You don't really believe him. You haven't really been walking in obedience to him, because your reaction to me when I actually show up in front of you, and your reaction of rejection and disbelief shows that you're not really walking with God, because I am God and I'm here in front of you and you're rejecting me. If you loved God, you would love me, because I am God. He doesn't say that, but I think that's the implication of what he's saying. So then he goes on at the end, he says, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Okay, so considering that, who are the sheep? Who can rightly be called God's sheep, a child of God, a child of Abraham? Well, again, I think if we consider Abraham, what we just looked at brings a lot of clarity, and I'll explain why, and what I'm about to talk about, I think, brings a lot of clarity. So let me ask the question, was Abraham a sheep? Let's say, obviously Abraham died long before Jesus actually appeared on earth. But Abraham was a sheep, right? Let's say Abraham was actually alive when Jesus was born and when Jesus started his ministry. And let's actually say Abraham, maybe he was disguised, he was there in the midst of that crowd. Abraham would be rightly defined as one of the sheep, right? Even though Abraham had been walking with God, right? He had been believing God. When Jesus actually then showed up on the earth, if Abraham had been there, what Jesus gets at in those verses we just saw is that Abraham would have openly embraced Jesus and received him and known him and recognized his voice. Well, why? Why would Abraham have been a sheep and recognized the voice of Jesus and believed him? Well, because Abraham was already walking with the Father, right? He was already believing the Father. Abraham was already a sheep of God who was obeying the voice of God, who was listening to the voice of God, who was following the voice of God. So naturally, when God would show up on earth, if Abraham had been there, Abraham would have naturally recognized God's voice. He would have naturally recognized God as his shepherd in the voice of Jesus, and would have gone and continued to follow him in the person of Christ. So considering that, what we can see is that the sheep of God aren't those who God has predetermined from before the foundations of the earth to be sheep. Before Jesus appeared on earth, there were those who were already walking with God in faith and obedience. I don't think anybody would debate that. I think even the disciples would probably fit into that category, that many of them were probably, faithful Jews and probably had a measure of faith in the light that God had given them. And regardless of whether that was the disciples or not, I think we know that there were people, there were people like Zacharias and people like Mary, the mother of Jesus, and people like John the Baptist, people that had faith at the time. They already had faith in God, even though Jesus wasn't. They had no conception of Jesus Christ, the person, yet. They didn't know the full details of who the Messiah was. But what they were doing is they were living in walking in the light that God was giving them, that they already had, that they were walking in relationship with the Father, and ultimately they had always been knowing and believing in Jesus, because as we saw, like Jesus says about Abraham, that Abraham rejoiced that he would see the day of Jesus. So inasmuch as a person in the Old Testament was walking with God, they were walking with Jesus, even though they didn't have the full details yet of who he was. And that was the case of Abraham, that Jesus said that Abraham rejoiced, that inasmuch as he was walking with the Father, right? He was walking with God, he was believing God, he was obeying God's voice. And Jesus correlates that and equates that to having been really walking with him and rejoicing to see him and really trusting and hoping in him. And it wasn't that Abraham had all the facts about who Jesus was and knew all the details about that, but Jesus says, he says that him and the Father are one, right? So if you are walking with God, the Father, you are walking with the Son, because they are one. You can't be believing in and walking with and having a relationship with one without being in relationship with the other. And so what that means is that when Jesus actually showed up on earth at this point in history, that prior to that, and at that same time, there were already people who were walking with him, that were already walking with God, right? They were already sheep who knew the voice of God and were following him and obeying him. They were like Abraham, who were children of God, right? They were walking in the footsteps of the faith of Abraham. Again, they didn't have all the information about who Jesus was, about who the Messiah was, about what all that would look like, about what their redemption would be, but they were trusting in God and they were believing, really, they had faith in the gospel before even knowing the full details of the gospel, because they were believing God. And to believe God is to believe Jesus. That's the argument that you constantly see Jesus making in the Gospel of John. And really, I think that's a huge emphasis of John, because you see that kind of language in his epistles too, where he talks about if you receive the Son, you will receive the Father, and vice versa. And so I think that's really what Jesus is getting at here, is that he's saying, look, if prior to me coming, if you are amongst the people who are truly God's, if you are really in obedience, if you are really righteous, if you are really my sheep, then if you're really the sheep of God, right? If you're really the sheep of God, then when I, God, show up in human form and stand before you and am talking to you, you are going to recognize my voice, and you're going to hear me, you're going to receive me, because you're already my sheep. You've already been walking with me. You've already been following my voice. You've already been, David would fit in this category. If David had been alive, the Lord is my shepherd, right? I shall not want. So God was David's shepherd. And so again, if David had been alive at this point in time when Jesus showed up and started preaching and teaching, well, just like Abraham, David rejoiced to see his day. He would have gladly embraced Jesus. He would have recognized his voice again, because David had been walking with God as his shepherd. And so when God shows up on the scene in the form of Jesus, obviously David is going to recognize the voice of his shepherd, who he's already been walking with.